pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, who I have never met visually until right this evening on here, but she kindly volunteered, Dr. Patricia Markert, who is just starting as a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Western Ontario. And I saw she had joined the department, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to get to meet her for people in the local community as well as in the more general Ontario community. I always have to note how grateful I am that people do agree to give talks. I know it's not easy sometimes, especially, you know, you get busy doing other things, but we really appreciate it. And I appreciate her agreeing to talk to us with no hesitation when I asked her, which is great, and quickly. Now, Dr. Markert, to introduce her, is a member of the Register of Professional Archaeologists, which for those who don't know, the RPA is a major organization dedicated to promoting the best of archaeology. She's worked in archaeology for 15 years on a wide range of field products. Well, she's produced archaeology products too, about a wide range of archaeology projects in the Northeast and the Atlantic region of the US, as well as the Southwestern United States, and even in, Andrew will be happy to hear this, Ancash, Peru. Dr. Markert received her BA from Temple University, which, as I recall, is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 2010. She had a major in anthropology, but I also saw she had a minor in photography, which probably plays well into her talk with photogrammetry that she's going to talk about, I think, tonight, and some of her work on that. She then went on to get her Master's of Applied Anthropology from the University of Maryland in College Park, where her advisor was Dr. Mark P. Leone, who is extremely well-known archaeologist from both his theoretical work and for his work in historical archaeology. And of course, her historic work will figure tonight in her talk. And then finally, she received her PhD from Binghamton University in Binghamton, New York. I guess it's SUNY Binghamton, technically, I suppose, the State University of New York system in 2022, advised by Dr. Ruth Van Dyke. And her thesis topic was related, obviously, to what she's going to talk about tonight, and which figures of her recent publications. Her research has been supported by several agencies, which goes to show you the quality of the research, I think, namely the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, the National Geographic Society, the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Council of Texas Archaeologists, the Medina County Historical Commission, and the Binghamton University Research Foundation. And among other things, she has served as chair of the Register of Professional Archaeologists Ethics Committee from 2018 to 2020, as well as on several other committees concerned with ethics and equity in archaeology, including for the Society for American Archaeology, as well as the Canadian Archaeological Association. So without further ado, I turn it over to her. Dr. Markert.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here with everyone tonight. Such a wonderful opportunity, as you said, to meet folks in the London community, and I'm looking forward to being there with you in person sometime soon. I'm actually joining from outside of Philadelphia. I'm joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Lenape, and this is also where I grew up. Chris mentioned Temple University, which is my alma mater. And I'm grateful that Zoom has allowed us to have these types of convenings in our current era. So I hope today is the first of many conversations and collaborations. Tonight I'll be talking about my work in Texas, looking at how 19th century migrant communities and descendants navigate questions of place, landscape, and identity in the generations that follow a migration event. And the area that I will be talking about is the traditional homelands of the Lipan Apache. It's worth noting, and I'll discuss this in brief, but a big part of this wave of migration was actually part of the displacement of the Lipan Apache people and the Comanche, among others, in this region of Texas. So that we can think a little bit about how intersecting migrations, placements, and displacements happen in settler colonial North America. So the title of my talk is Rubble History, Approaching the Ruins of 19th Century German Migration to Texas. And you'll notice that I talk a lot about Alsatian migration as well. The community that I will be speaking about was primarily an Alsatian community with a few German migrants. German migration to Texas actually was concentrated a little further north in here in what they call German Hill Country. But the structure we're going to be looking at tonight was built by and lived in by German migrants. And so we're going to be focusing on that aspect of this particular migration. within the broader context of the entire kind of migration era there. So the question that I ask is, what can ruined structures alongside other forms of historical and oral historical evidence tell us about the decisions generations made as they negotiated identities after the initial migration event? So I take an interdisciplinary approach that combines historical archaeology, oral history, architecture, methods from linguistic anthropology like narrative analysis, some digital methods like 3D photogrammetry, as we'll see, and archival research. And I also want to note that this has been a community-based project. So I've worked closely with community members at all phases of the project. So that includes descendants of Alsatian, German, and Mexican migration to this particular area. I call the talk Rubble history. That is an allusion to the type of construction that we're looking at. And you can see that here in one of the 3D models that I generated from this town of Dehennis, as I'll speak about in a moment. It's called rubble rock construction. So these are rubble rock buildings, and they're dry laid pieces of both found and chiseled limestone and sandstone. And this was a very common vernacular in this part of Texas that sort of rose from German and Alsatian and French migration to the area and the constraints of the resources that were available at the time. So this is a very typical version of what one of these 1 or 2 room structures would look like. It would have had a very sloped roof and a loft where usually people would sleep. So I also like the title Rubble History because it is a bit of a metaphoric reference to the way that I come to know these buildings in my research. So I'm piecing together fragments of the story from the architectural remains, from the oral histories, from the archive, and from my work alongside community members who remember them and to whom these mean something too. So to orient us quickly in space and time, the work I will be talking about today takes place in a small town called Dehennis. And if you can see my cursor, that's this town right here. It's located about 60 miles or 96 kilometers west of San Antonio. Today, that's about an hour drive along fast-moving Highway 90. That's this thoroughfare you see here. And that was built in the 1950s following World War II. When Dehennis was settled in 1847, this distance was a multiple day trip, often on foot or with pack animals. So it was not one that people embarked on lightly. It was a very isolated place. Casterville, too, I'll mention in a moment, was a similar town that factored into my dissertation research. I won't be discussing it here, but an interesting note is that it's now known as the Little Alsace of Texas. So if you were to visit, they have Alsatian architecture, food, a dance, they host a festival. It's a very neat place, but we're going to be focusing on the smaller community of Dehennis over here. Now, if anybody's been to South Texas, this can be a fairly inhospitable landscape to the unaccustomed traveler on foot. It's primarily open scrubland. It's perfect for cattle raising. There are rattlesnakes, there's streams that flood or run dry depending on the season. There's intense heat in the summer and sometimes intense cold in the winter. In fact, just as a fun note, it's 85 degrees down there today, so a bit different than Philadelphia and London. As you drive the highway today, you eventually meet up with the railroad tracks, which run parallel to the north, and those will take you all the way to Dehennis. And the railroad is a key part of this puzzle. It was built in the 1880s, and we'll return to that later. But to go back to the time period where I begin, that's the period of settlement. So starting in 1847, when a group of Alsatian migrants made the trek from Casterville west to establish the settlement of Dehennis. And this was a photograph here. It's a dirt road in that open scrublands that I took on a collaborator's ranch during a day that I spent with them in 2018. Here you see a photograph of the main marker and sort of landmark of the town of Dehennis. It's the ruin of St. Dominic's Catholic Church. And I'll note that there's a cemetery to the side of the church here. And there's an often repeated story that has become an origin story of sorts to the town. It's almost risen to the level of a local myth. And it's repeated in sources in the archives from the turn of the 20th century, and it's told in oral histories today. So the story goes like this, very brief. Many of the men went ahead from Castroville to prepare the landscape, to clear lots. And on the day that their families were due to make the 2-day trip, one of the older daughters of one of the families fell severely ill trying to cross a very flooded creek. So this was during a period of flooding. She was helping smaller children cross. I don't know exactly what happened, but it sounds like she may have gotten water in her lungs, and they rushed her to the kind of nascent settlement in order to try to save her life. She did pass away shortly after arriving, and she became the first burial of the new colony in the cemetery that you see here. So stories like this, like I said, it's repeated very frequently. And when people tell them, they often serve the purpose of contrasting the ease with which we traverse this same landscape today with the dangers of a bygone era. So for them, kind of mythic era of frontier settlement. And these stories show up frequently in the oral histories. There's different versions, different ways that they manifest when we talk about historical migration. And like those stories here, I'm using this to set a particular stage of settlement, of migration, landscape, and memory, and of the frontier mythology that can be rooted in a grain of truth. And it is true that the young girl, her name is Marianne Rudinger, her headstone is located in this cemetery. Now, whether it's the exact location of her burial is difficult for us to say today, but she was a person who existed and who did pass away tragically on what many consider the first night of the new settlement. So Tehennis was for years an isolated settlement on Tehennis's frontier, which the frontier, of course, is itself a construction that is built of migration and displacement. So while the initial migrants were Alsatians, several who came in the early 1850s were from parts of Germany. And that's one of the families that we'll be taking a look at today. This colony, like others in the area, was the result of the Republic of Texas's impresario system. So the impresario system is not unlike other settlement campaigns in the United States and Canada, and in Mexico as well, where migrants were recruited from elsewhere and provided land and incentives in order to settle. And this was often used as a strategy to secure indigenous land for the settler state. In Tehennis, migrants were mostly poor farmers from Alsace, which is a thin region along the Rhine between France and Germany. It famously went back and forth. It's a borderland in and of itself. In parts of Germany, and these were also contested landscapes. There was a lot of conflict, and so there was a lot of incentive to move to a new place. By 1850, the population of Tehennis was less than 100 people, a very small settlement. By 1860, it was closer to 200, but most of that growth was from growing families and from additional migration of family members from France and Germany, also being part of France at the time. The small settlement didn't pose much of a threat to the Lipan Apache and the Comanche who lived on this landscape at the same time. But as settlement into the area increased and traffic increased, so did tensions and violence became commonplace. Many Alsatians and Germans joined the Texas Rangers and went to war against indigenous peoples in this area. And the Texas Rangers, among other efforts, were a targeted campaign, very effective in their efforts to eradicate people from their ancestral landscape. There were no treaties in Texas. So that's all part of sort of the intersecting migrations and movements that constellate around this particular settlement. Now, the construction of the railroad in the 1880s heralded a new era for Tehennis. There was a lot of traffic. The railroad, what would later become the Southern Pacific, put a depot 1.5 miles northwest of the settlement of Tehennis. And so over the next couple of decades, the entire town migrated to the area of the depot, leaving behind the rubble rock structures of the original settlers. This was about 30 years after the settlement was founded, completing in about 1914 when they built a new church, and the church that I showed you a few slides back was abandoned. So it was a gradual but also relatively quick process. And what you had was new Tehennis, built in brick, local brick, and kind of bearing the aesthetic of the American West railroad towns. We won't be talking much about New Tehennis, but you see a photo of that here. Now, the old rubble rock houses in that area became known as Old Tehennis, and that's where my work is focused archaeologically. So in 2017, as I began defining the contours of this project, I attended what locals in Tehennis, Texas called the Homecoming Picnic, They also call it the 4th of August, regardless of what day in August it falls on, because that was the original date of the gathering. They've been doing it for over 150 years. And at the picnic, it was kind of a very hectic time. Introductions were being made, and I was introduced to a man named Polo Rodriguez, whose grandfather and grandmother migrated to Tejenis in the early 1900s when fleeing the Mexican Revolution. And the Rodriguez family, who turned out, owns the properties for several of the rolled rock houses of Persian and Alsatian origin I was interested in looking at. Sit. So Polo lived in one such house as a child. And he and I became friends and long-term collaborators. And I need to give him a large thank you too, because he is a person who really has made this research possible. So structure 2, the second structure my crew and I recorded, is also known as the Peter Cook House. That's what we'll be talking about today. And it was the most overgrown and had the densest tree cover of any of the extant ruins that we recorded. So in total in the project, which was called the Old Tejenis Archaeological Mapping Project, there were 6 ruins that we recorded, including 1 log dogtop cabin and 5 rubble rock buildings. They were all built between roughly 1847 and 1860. And though you could stand meters from this particular building on the street, you see the corner here, you could not see it through the dense brush. And so I was actually unaware of its location until it was pointed out to me by Polo as I was planning my field season. And just for comparison, you can see this here. This is in 2023, so very recent. The tree cover is obviously, they had a very dry year, so it's mostly gone. And then also the clearing that my crew and I did has rendered this a little bit more visible than it was in the 2016 photo a few years prior. So you can see what we're talking about in terms of location and growth. So our process in terms of how we approach the archaeology of this building. And we were not excavating, we did not collect artifacts. The goal of the project was to clear and record the extant structures. So we would first assess the structure and its condition, taking initial photos and detailed notes on the level of growth, the stability of the walls, surface features and artifacts. Then we would spend several days clearing it using a variety of tools, as you can imagine. So anything from chainsaws to hedge clippers to leaf blowers to just brushes and pans. And the goal was to expose as much of the building and its collapse as possible for 3D photogrammetry, and also for manual mapping and measured elevation drawings, which we did by hand. So here you see a before and after shot of the structure that I'll be talking about. So again, quite overgrown, and my crew did a really beautiful job of clearing this one out so that we could take a really good look at it for the project. So next, we mapped and recorded individual rooms and areas within the structures, using iPads to capture images of surface finds and architectural details. You can see me in the right photograph here using one of those iPads in the field. We take GPS points at each corner using a handheld Trimble, photographs using a north arrow and meter stick, and then we would select walls and architectural features for those measured elevation drawings. So I'm going to kind of go through. You can see we would record surface finds in the field. We would also leave them where they lie. We did architectural detail shots. This one is from structure 2, which we'll be talking about. I may come back to this photograph because there's actually something interesting happening there. And then the measured elevation drawings. And so these, we would target external walls and also interesting interior elements like fireplaces or stovepipes. Finally, I did close range photogrammetry using a Canon SL2 DSLR camera and a monopod. This was not drone work. I was doing it all by hand. And so this consisted of taking 1,000 to 2,000 photographs roughly per structure at specific intervals around the building to input into Agisoft Metashape Pro. Which then produced a detailed and scaled 3D image of the ruin. So these are just 2 screenshots of the model that we have for structure 2, and I'll be pulling this up so that we can take a closer look at it. I would ensure scale by placing meter sticks around the structure. You can't quite see them here, but also taking very precise measurements of windows and doors and other elements. The more the better in Metashape for that precision of measurement. And the end result is the model, which you see here, and I'll bring up shortly. But one of the neat things about that too, and digital archaeology, is that I was able to do quite a bit of digital mapping after the fact, after the field. So having a scaled digital model, I was able to later create detailed plan views of the structures like the one you see here. You can see it compared with the aerial shot. It let me return and measure certain architectural elements, check and calibrate the hand-drawn elevations. Am I still doing? I froze a little bit there. You can hear me? Good, okay. Check the hand-drawn elevations and also conduct an ongoing detailed architectural analysis as I learned new things about this vernacular architectural style. So finally, the 3D models also present, and I'll go back to the community aspect of this project, a really fabulous community engagement tool. So, and an accessibility tool, because many of the people that I work with are in their 80s and 90s and aren't able to go and see these structures in person, but are keenly interested in what the archaeology is finding. And so the 3D models have allowed me to bring that to community members in a way that's accessible to them. So the final models are uploaded onto Sketchfab, and we're going to head over there now for the next part of this presentation. So, all right, and you should be able to see structure 2 there. Hopefully it's so. This is Sketchfab. It allows us to upload these models and share them with a wider audience. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Actually, let's put it in the view that you would have from the street, because that's where we're going to move to next. So if you were looking at it through the trees from the street, this is what you would see. So one of the things that I was interested in assessing as I approached these structures was not just their moment, or as we'll see, moments of construction, but also how they've continued to exist on landscapes and in memory as continued participants in placemaking and emergent perspectives on history and heritage in these communities. With that in mind, I'm going to move into discussing interpretations and analysis of the house, but I'm going to toggle between past and present in my approach to this particular ruin. And so as I reconstruct these homes, I seek out those that remember what they looked like, and also, when I'm extremely lucky, photographs that exist in the archives. In 2018, as we finished our work at Structure 2, we had cleared it out. My crew member, Emily, and I recorded a driving tour with a woman named Melvira. She was an elder in the community, at the time 98. I regret to say she recently passed away, but at the amazing age of 103. And she and I worked closely together for many years. As I mentioned, the ruin was usually obscured by woods. And so you wouldn't be able to see this, but on this particular day, you could see this view that we have here for the most part. So we come around on the street and we stop in front of the house, and thanks to the excellent efforts of my crew, it was clear for the first time in decades. And someone else in the car said, "Oh, you've been working. Wow, I've not seen it like this." And Melvira kind of sighed and said, "Oh, this was such a pretty house. I loved this house." So I asked Melvira a few questions about what it looked like. There's not much of it left. It's very difficult to reconstruct an idea of what this home might have, how this home might have appeared. And so she remembered an L-shaped home with a wraparound porch and a brick patio. She said there was a sulfur well, and the well is still there, that was used for local medicinal purposes. Now, this is a very decomposed ruin. And so by the time I arrived at my analysis, I really was working to reconcile Melvira's memory of this beautiful house with white walls and a wraparound porch with the current state of ruin. There is evidence for the porch there. There's evidence for the brick patio, but it's difficult to really picture what it might have looked like standing. And some of the other ruins I had photographs of, but not this one. So this is a fascinating house, actually. It was locally known as the Peter Koch house, but actually 2 separate Peter Kochs lived there. The first was an older man who migrated from Germany with his adult children, who then proceeded to raise families in Texas. But he and his wife, Helena, who were in their late 50s at the time of arrival, they migrated with them. And they built a stone home to live out their twilight years. And they built that home in 3 phases. So I'll point out here, we'll kind of spin around. You can see the first, second, and third phase of the building here. This would have been a 1-room structure. Then you have this seam here. So this was an addition, and there was a doorway on either side here. So it wasn't even completely connected to the original structure. And then a 3rd room was added. And these likely happened in relatively quick succession as resources became available. And there's some interesting things here that I want to note. So this rubble rock home actually differs in some ways from the dominant rock house style seen throughout this area. You might remember the model that I showed in the early part of the presentation. A really common arrangement is symmetrical window, door, window. So door with flanking windows. They generally follow a 16 by 32 foot plan. They have a sloped roof with a loft. Now, this house made no efforts at symmetry. It was built a bit piecemeal, and it didn't really follow the same conventions as younger migrants building their homes in this community. It also lacks some of the kind of careful construction techniques. So if you look here, we have loosely coined corners. That's where you have alternating larger squared stones to stabilize the corners and also entrances and windows. They did that here, but if we look at other models, and maybe I can bring one up at the end of the presentation, it's really beautifully done in other buildings. There was a little bit less care taken here, and I don't think that meant there was less care in the home, but there wasn't the same level of kind of adherence to aesthetic sensibility for this particular family, this older family. Like many German migrants, this was another difference. So many of the Alsatians in the community opted for grand fireplaces. And there's actually some interesting details about Alsatian fireplaces and the ways that they would construct them that we see in the other buildings. Now, this building did not have a fireplace. What it did have was two wood-burning stoves, which there's a few publications that will note that Germans actually preferred the wood-burning stove in other parts of German Hill Country in Texas to the construction of a fireplace. So this is one of the few homes we see that with in Dehennis. It's possible that Peter and Helena, his wife, were building a home that resembled what they left behind in their homeland, using things that were familiar to them. There also is a slight difference between the rubble that was used in this earlier construction with this tall wall, which would have been an exterior wall, and the rubble that's used later. All of this, so we have sandstone over here, and I believe this is sandstone here as well, but all of this was likely collected from local rock beds. Very few pieces of it show any sign of being shaped or cut, which again differs from what we see in other buildings. And this likely had a thatch roof at first, later cypress shingles, and eventually the tin that you see kind of in bad shape right here. So that's a little bit about Peter and Helena's house. It just would have been these 3 rooms. And when they passed in the early 1880s, their newlywed grandson, who was also named Peter Koch, moved in with his wife, Teresa. And this was the first Texas-born generation. They grew up in a German and Alsatian-speaking enclave, again, quite removed from San Antonio. But they had spent their lives in Texas. And one of the first things they did was update the home and expand it using a new resource to the area, which was bricks. So if we look at this from a plan view again, you'll see that the home is L-shaped. And what the younger generation did was add this brick addition. So the interesting thing about these bricks, Dehennis is actually has a brick industry. It's known for its bricks. They're very dateable. And these are what we call Walworth bricks. They were fired by hand by a local man before the big brick industries came on the scene in about 1904. And so they are very kind of a tight range that we're looking at from about 1890 to 1900 that people would have been building with these particular bricks. We see those bricks used here, and so that gives us a sense of when this addition was added. They added 2 rooms to the south, giving the house its distinct L shape, and eventually they added a brick-lined patio as well. Now, those are the industry-formed bricks from later, so the patio came probably a few decades after they added the initial addition. This was about the same time that Victorian styles were coming on the scene in Texas. These were very traditional communities. They were small enclaves. They were still speaking German and Alsatian primarily amongst themselves. And with the coming of the railroad in 1881, you start to see Victorian styles come on the scene. So I had to wonder, maybe the L-shaped Victorian homes is informing their decision to kind of update the house in this way. So I wondered if that's what we were seeing is a young couple revisioning an old migrant home, using the styles and influences and the resources of the day. So they certainly decided to expand. They raised a large family in this house, but I was wondering, was this also an expression of, or even an assertion of, an identity closer to that dictated by American fashion and aesthetics at the time? And thinking about the changes that they did make, we see the addition of a porch, which is a distinct Texan American element, a patio, and so forth. But I still longed for a photograph, just because while I piece together a lot of this, it doesn't necessarily mean that I can get a good, adequate picture of the home, though I can understand its construction. Now, this is a little moment of serendipity in my research that I'll share with you next. As I was writing this part of my dissertation, I had resigned myself to the fact that no photograph likely existed of this one. But then in 2021, I stumbled on an unlabeled photograph from the Fanny Ratchford collection that exists in the Texas Digital Archive. It had just been digitized a few years before, and it had been taken in about 1932. Now, I should say that Teresa, Peter's wife, lived in this home probably until about the late 1930s, early 1940s upon her death, and it was not occupied past that date. So when I found this photograph, and I found this and I stared at it because countless hours of analysis later, I recognized the house. Now, there's not a lot that lends itself from this to the ruin, but having engaged with it to the level that we did, both on the landscape and digitally, I began recognizing some of the elements. And this was just one of those things where I had to call people. I was so excited to find a picture of it. But you can see the shape, the distinct L structure. You can see the well, which again still exists, and you can even see the outlines, I'll zoom in a little here, of this brick patio. And I will say that while we did not excavate the patio, it was just below kind of the level of the soil on the surface, and so we could easily scrape parts of it away to confirm it was there. And it did follow this general shape. And so here were these elements, and I owe this a lot to Melvira's description as well, because I see the wraparound porch, again, the well, the brick patio, and the white walls. But the interesting thing about this photograph is that it changed my mind about a lot of things. This house does not resemble the Victorian era. Here's the brick addition, but the interesting thing about the brick addition is that it actually was whitewashed to resemble the rest of the house, to make a continuous thing, which isn't surprising, but also to resemble the other migrant homes in the area. It actually displays that door and flanking windows arrangement that we see in the other rock rubble homes of about 2 decades prior. It has the steep sloped roof, the cypress shingles that we see in the area. And these were elements that were actually lacking in the older generation's construction, which I pointed out earlier. And you can see this isn't quite symmetrical over here. So that's the older part of the home. But, what we see is a young couple drawing on the elements that were familiar to them in the town that they grew up in. And I think that that's very interesting from a generational standpoint, but they were also adding elements that they had come to be familiar with in Texas and in kind of American architecture. So a porch was not a traditional thing on many of these Alsatian homes, but it was an element on some of the wealthier ones. So they might have been making, imagining a future together with a certain status, but they were borrowing from that American and Texan tradition of adding a porch. And then also an interesting note is the patio, that's not a common thing here, and it clearly connects the well to the home. So again, the well was noted to be a sulfuric well. I think that it may have been actually a source of income. Potentially people used it for medicinal purposes and traveled to this house, though there's very little archival trace of this. We mostly have this in the oral histories. But having a L-shaped house arranged around a patio like this actually more closely resembles some of the Mexican Texan styles that we would see with a courtyard or an open area kind of extending the home outward and inward. So while they were using the new materials to recreate the look of the homes they grew up with, and they were expanding this rock house into a slightly grander structure with their own future in mind. So it was a beautiful house, as Melvira remembered. And there is one more interesting piece of information from the archive, a snippet story that I'll kind of conclude with before we start talking about some final thoughts, which is an 1885 story which appeared in a few local area Texas newspapers. So the short article was about 2 or 3 sentences in length, and it reported that a fire destroyed the home of Mrs. Peter Koch. Now, the Koch's name is spelled K-O-C-H. The name in the article was spelled C-O-O-K, same phonetically. And so it was something that was easily passed over in the archive, but there would have only been one Mrs. Peter Koch in the town at this time. And it reported that a fire destroyed her home while she was at church. There was no insurance to rebuild and they lost everything in the home. Now, I didn't see a lot of evidence of burning, but when I found this particular note, I did have to note that the sandstone in the first part of the building was actually discolored in a pinkish way, which is something that happens to sandstone when it's heated. So this is very possibly about them. But that might also be another impetus for the expansion and the renovation of the home. They may have done it because they simply had no choice. So these are all interesting things that come together to kind of highlight the ways that 2 generations, 1 generation apart, were navigating home and identity alongside migrant styles from the old Dehennis settlement, as well as new resources and ideas that were coming into the area, particularly with the railroad. So it's likely that Peter and Teresa Koch, the 3rd generation, still spoke Alsatian and German. And I'll note that that was actually spoken in this area until about the 1940s. They were also Texan. So in the Peter Koch house, we see 2 different generations making decisions about home architecture and their place in Dehennis and the wider world during a period of rapid change. While the elder Peter and Helena built a home that suited their needs and ideas as people who had spent the better part of their lives in Germany, their grandchild and his wife, Peter and Teresa, drew on those older migrant styles of their hometown, as well as the influences and materials of their era in Texas. Now here you see what we call the Matthias Koch house. Matt Koch was Peter Koch's son and the Peter M. Koch, the grandson's father. And so this was located across the road and across the creek, but it might give you a sense of the thatched roof and what this home might have looked like back before the renovation. And I include it here because while I don't know if Peter Koch is in this photograph, it's very possible that he is the one kneeling here, the father. The structure to the Peter Koch house demonstrates how the built landscape can reveal how migrant identities are in negotiation long after the initial migration event. And not just German and Alsatian migration, but Mexican migration and the influx of Americans into the area with the stagecoach line and later the railroad. And an interesting tidbit is actually the word for outsider in Alsatian that was spoken in this and throughout this area is Amerikaner. So an American was considered an outsider at the time and well into the 20th century. So I'm going to leave it at that with immense gratitude to the London chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society for hosting me tonight, to the many people, communities, and funding that made this research possible.